Hey guys, hi, welcome back once again. My name is Vaishali, and having learned quite a few things from, through, and from within human interactions, and having pursued and completed my master's in business administration and in clinical psychology, I today wish to talk about trauma, or rather, our internal wounds, the emotional, the psychological wounds, which may not appear huge when we talk of the word trauma, they still unconsciously drive our relationships and our interactions, both within the closed spaces, within our interpersonal close associations, and with the larger world outside as well. So many a times, many of us consider trauma as a huge event that kind of distorts our reality and our association with the world. So many a times, many of us consider trauma as something huge that kind of suddenly, in a 180-degree flip, changes our view of the world. And many a times, we would assume those to be warlike situations. Situations where tsunami happens and huge devastation happens. An accident that happens, a molestation or a rape that happens. Being bullied by somebody within the family or in the school environment or in any organized setup where one begins to feel cornered by external forces, by external sources. And though events like these cause both external and internal trauma, both explicit and implicit traumas, the ones that are obviously visible and the ones that are not so visible, the ones that take place in our internal psyche, in our internal worlds, trauma can also run in more implicit ways, in more chronic ways, in more subdued ways than many of us actually realize. So, from that point of view, wherein the wounds are more internal and are not explicitly, objectively visible, how do they then appear to be? How do they sound like? How do they feel like? The ones that are more implicit, the ones that are more subdued. So it can manifest as freedom itself. So if I were to say and if I were to share that I met somebody who's been traumatized by freedom, that almost sounds like it doesn't make any sense as to how can one be traumatized by freedom itself. But say somebody's association with freedom has been with inconsideration, has been with irresponsibility, has been with they not being prioritized even as a kid, despite having all of the financial resources, despite being financially very secure. It then kind of makes sense when the person says that I have difficulty visualizing, that I can't remember a larger part of my life, or it's very hard for me to remember a larger part of my life. It in a way tells us through the very words that they used that it is hard because it felt very hard, especially when they were growing up as a child. It clearly tells us that it is the nervous system wanting to avoid certain things which at one point in time felt so overwhelming that they and their nervous system were not able to deal with it, were not able to cope with it. And the most natural thing for any organism, including a human being, at that point in time, and for its nervous system, is to block off anything that feels too hard, that feels too overwhelming when there is no support system available, despite having everything that financial resources can provide. So here's this person who's actually telling the story that freedom to them means not being considered, that freedom to them means not being a priority, that freedom in their point of view, in their subjective experience, is basically having to deal with grown-ups who were completely neglectful, who were completely cut off from them and not connected with them in any manner possible. That to them freedom means being disassociated and not being connected. That freedom to them means that they are so unworthy of anybody's attention and care, and attuned attention and care, that they can be so easily neglected and left ignored. That from their point of view, freedom actually means being careless, wherein their internal world goes as a kid when they are growing up during their formative years, that I'm so worthless that the grown ups in my life cannot connect with me, do not wish to connect with me, that I'm so worthless and so invaluable, that I'm not worthy of having any connection, that I'm not worthy of being prioritized in somebody's life, even for a little bit, which from another lens is ill treatment of human being. A human being that is completely, as a kid, dependent on others for its basic survival, dependent on its basic needs, not just physical needs of food, water, shelter, and clothing, but also of psychological needs to be met by other grown up human beings. Which is why it doesn't surprise me when they have a dysfunctional relationship with themselves and with others. In fact, from my point of view, from my lens, it's the most organic, natural thing to happen. When the person finds it too hard to remember anything because things felt very hard, felt very overwhelming without having any support system, attuned support system with them, around them. So if we listen to that narrative, we'll be able to understand that trauma is not just what happens to us, though that's a part of it, but it's also what happens inside of us as a result of what happens to us. Now, say supposedly that this is a new plant, a new life that is just blooming, that is just coming up. And say after a few days, I stop paying any attention to it. I start neglecting it. Will it be fair on my part to then expect it to bloom, to then expect it to grow, when the environment that is there to support its growth, to provide it nourishment and nutrition, to take care of it, is being neglectful towards it? Will it be fair on my part to then assume that it will remain healthy and nourished even when I do not pay any attention towards it? Well, that would be I, acting out in senseless ways, having unrealistic expectations from this plant to grow and to bloom when it has not been attended to, when it has not been taken care of, when it has not been supported and nourished, when it has been neglected. And trauma encapsulates all of these psychological parameters within a spectrum. And in a way, it is also then telling us that trauma is anything that happens within us that overwhelms our system, that overwhelms us, and thereby makes us want to fight off the situation in dramatic ways, or makes us want to avoid the situations and fly away from it in very avoidant ways, or makes us feel stuck and frozen in a way wherein we feel that we have lost our capacity to respond, or in a way it makes us appease, do what everybody else wants us to do so that we don't have to face neglect, criticism, abandonment, attunement, attention, and a disillusioned sense of connection with others. Now, if I can take up some examples of Hindi movies or Bollywood movies that talks about trauma, we can consider movies like Animal, wherein this traumatized kid goes on to traumatize others as well, wherein this kid who wanted desperately a connection with his father kind of then becomes an overbearing person, very similar to his father later in his life. Movies like Sitare Zameen Par or Tare Zameen Par, which very clearly and yet very implicitly tells us how people get traumatized, how people feel disconnected, how people feel abandoned, how people feel neglected and rejected, how people are made to feel ashamed of they being a little different from their environment, from their surroundings. It's also reflected in movies like Dil Dhadakne Do, wherein there are far too many dynamics which are traumatic, which are unhealthy, and which to a large degree have gotten normalized. In this movie, Dil Dhadakne Do, for those of us who've seen it, we kind of understand that the husband wife relationship is traumatic, is a wounded relationship, that the parent child relationship is a traumatic, is a wounded relationship, wherein the relationship with others that they have is traumatic, is a wounded relationship, because all of them are trying to project an image of being perfect, of being happy and healthy on the surface level, while there's a lot of turmoil, while there's a lot of mistrust, while there's a lot of miscommunication and no communication, while there's a lot of coercive control, there's a lot of aggression and even passive aggression, a lot of disconnection or no connection with each other within the relationships itself. And in a way, very objectively speaking, it looks very hypocritical. It looks inauthentic. It looks untrustworthy. And all of these are aspects of trauma, of internal woundings. And in a way, it can be metaphorically put across like that there's a lot of plastering, a lot of varnish and painting that is done superficially while it's corroding inside, while it's rusting from inside. It can also be seen in the movie Shakuntala Devi, wherein there's this brilliant mathematician, an astrologer, who's far ahead of her times in terms of her skills, in terms of her abilities, in terms of her intelligence as a mathematician and as an astrologer, the one who's also known as a supercomputer of her times. And yet there's a human aspect of her which is very flawed, which is very dysregulated, and which is extremely manipulative as well, wherein just to maintain her own image, her own status quo, she kind of defames and shames her ex-husband, who was a very gentle, supportive soul and a very gentle and supportive and a caring father, may not have been as ambitious as her, but as a father, as a husband, was very supportive of her ambitions, of her desires, of her dreams, tells us that irrespective of the gender, and also including that even as a mother, as a woman, she was not attuned to her child. She was not supportive of her child's desire to stay rooted in one place, at least for a while. She was completely neglectful of the child's aspiration to remain connected with her father, which is why almost towards the end of the movie, it is also shown that as this child grows up, she wants to divorce her own mother, a thing that is probably never ever thought of. And not just thought of, but many dare not also think about it. In a way, it also tells us that this child feels so overshadowed, so overwhelmed by the presence of her own mother, that towards the end of the movie, and probably through the course of her lifetime, she comes to an understanding that the narrative of this relationship needs to change, which is why she files a divorce against her own mother. Probably one of the very few instances wherein a child actually thinks of taking such a step. Now, whether that actually happened or not, Or was it just a dramatic representation to pass on a certain message, to convey a certain message is a different thing altogether. And yet it conveys something. It in fact conveys a lot. With regards to feeling so overwhelmed, with regards to feeling so disconnected, with regards to feeling so overpowered by somebody else, with regards to not having one being heard or listened to, with regards to one's needs not being attended to, with regards to one's own parent shaming another parent in both the private and the public spaces, with not being able to trust her own parent, with not being able to trust her own mother, and probably living with the thought that if this person, the person that is my mother, can go to this extent to safeguard her own image, I'm not sure what levels she can go to, what boundaries she'll cross in order to maintain that image of hers. And so maybe it's time that we start considering all of these aspects and many more in this spectrum when we talk about trauma, or at least the internal traumas, the psychological wounds, the emotional wounds that, in my understanding, almost all of us carry within ourselves. Wherein at some points in time we have felt neglected, wherein at some points in time we have felt abandoned, wherein at some points in time we have questioned our self-worth, wherein at some point in time we have felt disconnected within our relationships, wherein at some point in time we disconnect from ourselves, wherein at some point in time we have felt outraged, wherein at some point in time we have suppressed and repressed many of our emotions, wherein at some point in time we felt that we are not worthy of expressing those things because nobody ever listens, nobody ever pays attention, nobody ever pays any heed to it. Wherein at some point in time we have felt betrayed, wherein at some point in time we have betrayed others and ourselves as well, wherein at some point in time we have had a hard time trusting others, connecting with others, sharing with others, leaning on to others, wherein at some point in time we've had trouble asking for help, asking for support, asking for nourishment and caring, wherein at some points in time we have found ourselves to be hypocritical. These are all the ways in which trauma manifests itself. And if we do not pay attention to that, if we are not aware of that, unfortunately, whatever does not get repaired and healed gets repeated. And thereby the choice is on to us to either pay attention, to notice it, to be able to attend to it, to be able to heal it, at least on to some degree, or to ignore it and repeat it. Let's try and think about all of those things. Let's try and observe all of those things if they have happened in our lives, trying to tell us something about ourselves. Let's try and do that for ourselves, and I will see you once again the next week. Till then, stay tuned in. And guys, if you do like the contextual content of these videos, please do like, share, and subscribe.